All right, so here's a review. I'm going to post the one from last year as well on the canvas. This one, go through as quickly as possible and hit some of the main points. So we're going to talk about both the West and the South real quick. So the West, we've now started continuing that manifest destiny, going into the plains. With the plains, they'll meet a number of Indian tribes: the Sioux, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, Nez Perce, Blackfoot. They have a nomadic lifestyle and communal ownership of the land. This, just like throughout much of history of the United States, doesn't really work with the new settlers colonizing. But one of the things that's going to push Americans into this region is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act gives 160 acres of land to anyone who's willing to improve it over 5 years, and also to pay a small fee filing paperwork. The first thing that really brought people out to the West was, of course, the gold rush in 1848, and then the actual opening up of the West will be done through the Transcontinental Railroad, which will be completed at Promontory Point in Utah. The railroad will bring in immigrants, both Chinese and Irish. If you think back to our classwork, we can think of some of the ways that the American Indian were treated. The Chinese laborers were treated. Additionally, Indians were forced off their land, put into new reservations, and forced to assimilate. Assimilation will also be an issue when it comes to the new immigrants coming in to work in the North and East. Because the U.S. government broke a number of treaties with the American Indian and the forced assimilation that happened, you're going to wind up with a variety of uprisings, the Sioux and Lakota uprisings, more restrictions put in place by the U.S. government into issues like the massacre at Sand Creek, where John Chivington will lead the army on a massacre of the Cheyenne Veterans Massacre, where once again he takes a small army in to try to fight the American Indian, but is crushed, which will lead to further issues like Little Bighorn or Custer's Last Stand, which will be where General George Custer, Union Army general, former Union Army general, was put in charge of clearing out the American Indian. He attempts to kill a large number of Sioux, but it turns out that it's an even larger meeting than thought. A lot of this is because of the gold found in the Black Hills. Because of this, it's published in newspapers, leads to basically the end of the American Indian period through a variety of Indian wars. Wars with the Nez Perce, creation of things like the Dawes Act, which is going to continue that forced assimilation. Dawes Act, just like the Homestead Act, is going to give 160 acres, but it's going to happen for any of the American Indian who are willing to assimilate. A Century of Dishonor will be a book published by Helen Hunt Jackson, laying out basically the 100 years that the United States has existed and their negative treatment of the American Indian. The Indian period is going to end at Wounded Knee in 1890 with a massacre of several hundred Sioux, and that will be the end of the Indian period. This West and South, as we've said, it's agricultural and lifestyle. Part of the reason why we had the Homestead Act brought people out and they dealt with violence towards the American Indian is because of this open range, which leads to cowboy cattle range things, which the cattle at the cowboy cattle drives will influence the industrial area as well, because this Latin American influenced cowboy culture and the cattle are raised throughout the West, the Great Plains, in order to provide them to the meatpacking plants to feed the people in the cities. The West, as we think of it as the open, kind of American dream, place for someone to make it, is ended up closed off by barbed wire created by Joseph Glidden in order to end the need for cattle drives. So barbed wire will be our invention that does that. The other reason people move out west is for gold. We wind up with mining towns, which bring people out quickly. There's a large boom followed by a bust as they run out of gold in areas like California or the Black Hills. Comstock loaded a silver mine up in Alaska, leading to also the Yukon gold rush. But it winds up a ghost town when everyone leaves after mining everything. This is, of course, an area where a large number of people can try to strike it rich and live the American dream, but many of the people who live there are working there under contract for someone who's able to buy the land. Continuing with the Homestead Act idea, the Oklahoma land giveaway in Oklahoma gave land to people in Indian Territory. It was also an opportunity for people to take land very cheaply if they were able to settle on it. New technology brings people out west, reapers, farm equipment, harvesters. The moral land grants are going to be created to boost education. Moral land grants, because people moving out west are going to need the education necessary in order to live as agricultural yeoman farmers. It's very hard living in the West. It's expensive to get wood out there. So people initially live in sod houses. The rough life will lead many people to leave the West and go back into the Northeast industrial areas. Industry will rise. Urbanization is going to take hold. Farming is going to decline as people move back over into the East. And also we're going to have the end of the frontier because we've taken over everything in the West. And that's laid out in Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. The frontier thesis says that the reason the United States has always been getting better is that we've continued to grow and grow and grow. Now, we're finished with that. What are we going to do? Well, the next thing we're getting into, we're looking at is the Spanish-American War, so we figured out that beyond that. The American people in the West, there's great debts. Many people are reliant on the railroad being that tie between the industrial North and the West. Weather problems, falling prices on things that are being grown by the farmers in the West, and the need for cheaper currency in order to get out of debt. So the railroads were abusing because they were using construction graft. And we've talked about graft when it comes to politicians, and they're using their position in order to gain favor for themselves. Same thing when it comes to these businesses. They're making unjust deals. They're bribing people. They're watering their stock to make their company look like it's even more valuable than it is. And they're offering rebates to large customers. So those who own the railroad companies are making deals with large-scale farmers in the West as opposed to small-scale. So that, in a way, we've got industrialization on both sides, whether it's agricultural industrialization or just the industry. So many of these industrial agricultural workers start something called the Grange in the Midwest. The Grange are a group of farmers, initially called the Patrons of Husbandry, that have evolved into a political group after having met in a social setting to try and discuss some of their grievances. As a political group, the Grange is able to put through the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is going to create the Interstate Commerce Act in order to put some restrictions on the railroads. The federal government does this in response to the Grange after they passed their Granger laws, which were found to be unconstitutional by Wabash versus Illinois. The reason they're unconstitutional, only the federal government is able to actually set any interstate trade plans. So the Grange then becomes the Populist Party. The Populist Party is only popular in the West and the South when it comes to the 1896 election. In the industrial East, McKinley is the one who is favored. He's going to win. So this takes place at the Grange. They're based on reform or changing things. They initially set up their party's plan in Omaha in 1892, the first election where they actually run. They want to increase the money supply by bimetallism. They want an income tax that's graduated, so if you make more money, you're taxed at a higher rate. They want an 8-hour workday, and they want immigration control because they're afraid that people immigrating in are taking their jobs. So 1893, another panic happens. This panic is going to lead to further need for bimetallism in their minds. So greenbacks are going to be issued paper money to represent, they've used greenbacks since the Civil War, but they wanted to represent both silver and gold. Gold supply is the gold standard is what's been used for quite some time. So as I was saying, William McKinley favored the gold standard, despite William Jennings Bryan. So we have Bryan versus McKinley. Gold bimetallism, and he's going to win the election, which will effectively kill the populist party. They had been absorbed into the Democrats for that election, but populism will then die as a political movement. So let's now look at what brings people into the Northeast, the industrial area. One, we are bringing in more and more new groups of immigrants, Eastern Europeans, Asian immigrants, those from Latin America. They're coming, long, hard journey through either Ellis Island or Angel Island. Angel Island in San Francisco, Ellis Island in New York. Great amount of culture shock. People are joining a new culture, joining this melting pot of society, which of course is going to lead to those who are already there. And we saw it within the populist party, nativist feelings. The first time the U.S. government uses a nativist policy, though, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, ending the immigration of the Chinese into the United States. Urbanization, part of the reason many people live in the East is because back in the 1840s, you had about 1 in 12 people who actually lived in the city. Now you're up to about 1/3 of people by 1900. Immigrants settled in ethnic communities to avoid culture shock. Also, there ended up being a great deal of people in one area, so it led to life in the tenements. Tenement houses are very small, cramped, tight, apartment complex type things. Usually you take one room, have it divided up into 4 to make more money for the landlord and also to provide somewhat cheaper living for those who are living there. Transportation is non-existent for people to get to the factories to work, so people have to live close. That is why the tenements thrive. Additionally, you have a great number of people, so crime rates are going to rise, and you have problems in the city like pollution, poor water, poor sanitation. Not to mention fire is always an issue because these are built out of wood at this point. So this awareness is going to come out of the social gospel movement. Social gospel movement will give birth to things like the Salvation Army, and also Jacob Riis will write How the Other Half Lived. How the Other Half Lives will give pictures to many Americans of what the city's actually like, how poor the living conditions are, and hopefully get people to start helping. Jacob Riis, in doing so, was a muckraker. A muckraker, of course, is someone who exposes the corruption of something in society. We saw that whenever we looked at Boss Tweed and Thomas Nast, of course, it's pre-muckraker movement. Jane Addams, I guess I actually forgot to tell you about her in class, so I'll make sure I do on Monday. Jane Addams is going to run something called the Hull House. The Hull House is an alternative to tenement living. This is a settlement home in Chicago. A settlement home is created in order to try to give real livable conditions at a lower price to immigrants so that they can try to make that American dream happen. So, speaking of muckraking, which we did just a moment ago, I said that Boss Tweed was our shining example of the Gilded Age of politicians. And some of the issues that were happening with corrupt government would have been like graft, which we mentioned just a little bit earlier, using politics for your own personal gain, receiving things like kickbacks or money back in return for creating a contract, which is also going to be one of the problems with the Grant administration, one of the scandals, and committing various types of fraud. This happens quite often when creating a political machine. The political machine is when one party comes to dominate an area, done through patronage, which is, of course, creating jobs for anyone who's willing to help support and create and get you elected repeatedly over and over again in an area. So one party dominates an area through the patronage system, various forms of loyalty, and of course, creating kickbacks and graft. The boss in charge is the person who's going to create many of the jobs, and also maybe not necessarily in the highest elected position, but they're the ones who are there. Many of these cities lack the services that are necessary, so this corruption is allowed to continue on because it's providing the necessary services for people to live. So he said Tweed, watch that video, he created things like orphanages, fire departments, policing, jails, all sorts of things that are beneficial to people, even if he is receiving great deals of money. So let's look at the presidents of this era. We have Grant. Now, of course, we're jumping back in time here. He's the first right after Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. Ulysses Grant, he, war hero, famous, easily elected, but scandal is the Credit Mobilier, which is a railroad scandal where the people in charge of making the railroad receive these very fraudulent contracts. They make their railroad as windy as possible, creating as much mileage as possible, being as they're paid by the mile. And they also receive all sorts of kickbacks to those who were in Congress. There's also the whiskey ring, another example of kickbacks happening. But lobbyists hold a great deal of influence, which are going to allow things like this to happen. Grant, after he steps down from office after one term, Rutherford Hayes is going to come into office. This is in the 1876 election, and this is also referred to as the Tilden-Hayes election, the second corrupt bargain. This is where Reconstruction will end. After Reconstruction ends, Republican remains in office, even though Tilden technically maybe would have won. He wants to run on ending the patronage system, but he's unable to. He works one single term. Then you have Garfield, another Republican, and Garfield once again runs on the idea of ending these, reforming politics, ending the patronage system. But within 4 months of him taking office, he is shot by Charles Guiteau. And Charles Guiteau shot him because he felt that he deserved a job that he did not receive. After Garfield dies, Chester A. Arthur is going to end up taking over the presidency, which he'll serve for one term, but he does get past some actual reform, and that is done through the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is going to end the patronage system and make it into a merit-based system where anyone who runs for office has to actually be qualified, or anyone who's appointed, after this, Grover Cleveland is elected one term. He wants to raise tariffs. It doesn't improve the economy. Harrison then serves one term. And then Cleveland is our only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He's elected again. Tariff and reforms are the major issue of this era. Doesn't win, but in the 1896 election, we know bimetallism will be the issue as you wind up between McKinley and Bryant, McKinley becoming the elected president. McKinley, of course, after the Spanish-American War, will end up being our next assassinated president, the third in 30-something years. So why did all this happen? Why was corruption able to thrive during the Gilded Age? Well, big business was able to thrive because of laissez-faire policies, high tariffs protecting American businesses, and a great amount of innovation. We know that this is the time period where the light bulb was created. You have Edison, you have Tesla, and electric power. Bessemer process creates steel. Steel is going to be really important to building our new buildings and growing our railroads, and the typewriter, phonograph. These things are going to help with communication. Some of the entrepreneurs you looked at, John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie, steel, J.P. Morgan is an investor, Vanderbilt with railroads and various types of shipping. We wind up with James B. Duke, our own local robber baron and his tobacco empire, Westinghouse, with electricity, a great number of influential, incredibly powerful people that will end up having disputes with the labor union. Labor unions, of course, were created to try to gain various rights for the workers. The unions, we can say they pretty much helped to make the 8-hour workday, various safety standards, etc., all actually happen. Sometimes they were living within company towns like Pullman, where we're going to have one of our strikes. A company town is where a company owns every single aspect of the worker's life. They work there, they live and pay their rent to the factory, and so it makes it a little bit unfair. Pullman, of course, creates railroad cars, which is important to this time period, as the railroad is the way to This is the interstate highway of the time. The Pullman factory, as wages are cut, they don't cut any of the living expenses, making it incredibly difficult for people to live. The big businesses were incredibly efficient through the manager system, and social Darwinism is what's going to propel them into these things. Social Darwinism, we've already said social gospel. Social Darwinism is that idea of the reason that those who succeed are successful because they're the fittest, strong survival of the fittest. It justifies the wealth. Andrew Carnegie is going to write the Gospel of Wealth, though, essentially saying that philanthropy is important to the life of any captain of industry or robber baron, which is the same thing. And they're able to grow their monopolies in various ways. So know the ways that monopolies are created. Whether it's horizontal integration, where all the same product is bought up, vertical integration, all the things that go into it, or if it's a trust where multiple companies are working as that monopoly. Finally, monopolies, their first attempt at getting rid of it is through the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 is going to be the first real attempt at breaking some of these monopolies. It's a weak law, but it sets the precedent for the future. The future will be where presidents like Teddy Roosevelt or Taft are going to start breaking up some of those things. So urban labor increased. You have incredibly dangerous working conditions. Labor unions are able to fight back, we said unions earlier, but they fought back through strikes, not working in order to try to harm the company. Through collective bargaining, many as one. Arbitration, bringing in a third party, to which owners were able to counter using blacklists, trying not to allow anyone who had been in a union to be hired by anyone, lockouts keeping workers out so they can't make money, scabs, bringing in people to replace them, or injunctions. We talked about a variety of different things. I already talked about the Pullman, so look back at your notes for that. I will put these PowerPoints up. Hopefully this was enough quickly. If not, there's another video up. And then as always, the videos by John Green, the crash course, should help you quite a bit. So hope you have a great weekend. Good luck. See you Monday. Ask questions.